It is Thursday, October 4th, 2018. My name is Ashton Ellett, here with another installment of the Two-Party Georgia Oral History Project, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia. Joining me today is Ms. Molly Dye Franklin. She is the founder and CEO of MDF Designs, LLC, which manufactures and markets adaptive apparel for the adult and teenage incontinent market. She is also the founder and principal of Molly Dye and Associates, a governmental affairs and public policy consulting firm. Prior to that, Ms. Franklin served as Vice President for Corporate Relations for the Duluth-based AGCO Corporation from 2001 until 2005. She is a graduate of the University of Georgia, and she also worked for many years for United States Senator Paul Coverdell. Thank you very much, Molly, for taking the time, an entire afternoon, to come over here and visit the University of Georgia.
You're so welcome.
Your old stomping grounds over here.
Yeah.
So I wonder if we could start by telling me a little bit about your childhood and your upbringing.
East Georgia, south of Augusta, in Waynesboro, Georgia, which is a small farming community.
Is that the bird dog capital of the world?
It is the bird dog.
Right.
Very few people know that, but it is true. It is the bird dog capital, and yes, my family spent more years with bird dogs than most anything.
Brittany's or English setters?
English setters.
Okay. I had one growing up myself.
Oh, they were the best. Fun names.
Ours
Nellie.
was Rudy.
We were Nellie,
Okay.
I'm remembering. My grandfather and father both were hunters and fishermen and enjoyed outdoors in that light as opposed to your more urban sports, tennis, golf, things like that. So I was of a hunting family on the farm, rode horses, and loved that lifestyle.
And you grew up mainly in Augusta.
Parents divorced very amicably when I was 12. Everything was fine. We moved to Augusta I was 12, maybe I was 13. This was 1970.
Okay.
And so my developmental years, maybe, I don't know that you can describe your teen years that way, but those were in Augusta.
Okay.
Those years. And I certainly visited and would go the 30 minutes, 45 minutes south back to the family farm every chance I got. And my grandmother and father still live there, so that was wonderful and fun, and adored my family.
So was your family what we would consider a political family, a politically involved or attuned family?
Yes, politically involved from the standpoint of always voting. You did not vote. In fact, one year in Washington, I was so fearful that my absentee ballot would not arrive on time that I Federal Expressed my absentee ballot, and I remember which election that was also. It was expensive. My family, my father was a precinct chairman for Barry Goldwater in 1964. I remember running around the house screaming the ditty. May I sing it?
Oh, absolutely.
Goldwater, Goldwater, he's our man. If he can't do it, nobody can.
So I think that officially makes you, were they the Goldwater girls?
Goldwater girls.
Yeah.
I don't know that you could be that at 6 years old, but I guess
maybe
I was.
a tryout.
Yes, yes. My family stayed attuned to politics. They did not participate in fundraising activities. They were not political donors, so to speak. But it was a favorite topic and subject, and I remember voting in the presidential election when I became registered for the first time. I did so over the phone, asking for whom do I, how do I do this, and for whom do I vote? I remember then, therefore, always. They say that my grandmother and father and stepmother were the first people to show up at the polls every election day at 7 a.m. They were voter number 1, 2, and 3. Certainly my mother and her husband the same. And
so, Georgia at that time, solidly Democratic state.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember, you were 6, obviously, but do you recall why your family was drawn to Barry Goldwater as opposed to Lyndon Johnson and the Democratic ticket?
I think it was reflective of my dad's interest in conservatism.
Okay.
Now, Barry Goldwater was certainly more libertarian.
Sure.
And he is no longer living, but I would have cast him the same. I would have said he just had a significantly conservative, libertarian streak. I'm afraid my mother might have voted more often as to did she like him or not.
Mm-hmm.
She voted for Steve Forbes in 1986 because she thought he was cute.
Steve.
And I rolled my eyes and thought that is ridiculous, but that's truly why she chose not to vote for Bob Dole. To each their own. I do remember when I knew I was a solid Republican, and I know the incident that caused me to be that. When I first went to the state capitol to work in January of 1981, I was told to park in a certain deck down Capitol Avenue. I don't remember taking parking tickets. I don't remember any of that. I didn't pay for the space.
Mm-hmm.
I was just told that's where to park, here's your space, and I did it. 21 years old, you need to question these things a little more. Sure enough, I received a statement maybe a year later from the state of Georgia. They had that my parking space was considered a 1099 form. It was more or less miscellaneous income. So I had to pay tax on the parking space because it was considered a benefit. Therefore, I had to withdraw money from my savings account at 21 years old, which is not a big savings account, to pay the tax. I stormed around my apartment for days because I complained about having to pay the tax, and my roommate, eventually she got tired of hearing about it, but that's when I knew I have to stop and think on what am I being taxed, how much, why is this legitimate? Mm-hmm. And then I thought, I really am a Republican.
Okay. I was when you started, I wondered if this was going to be a Speaker Murphy story, but it
was a true, legitimate, personal, financial situation that caused me to think these things through.
Right. So let's take a step back, and you attended the University of Georgia.
Yeah. What
brought you to UGA as opposed to
my
something else?
My parents had both been here.
Okay.
They had both graduated from here, which would have been 54, 55-ish. Had both loved it. Some of their best friends at that time were part of their relationships and friendships that they had established while they were here. Mm-hmm. I worried it was too big, and this was in 1980. I discussed it with my mother and said, I'm kind of scared, and the alternative was Georgia Southern. She said, do not do that because you will just end up transferring. Why don't you start? Go ahead and start at the bigger school. Just chomp the bullet and do it. Bite the bullet and do it. So that's what caused me to be here.
And you took a degree in fashion merchandising. Uh-huh. What drew you to that topic?
Well, as a typical teenager, and I loved clothes and fabric and sewing, and I loved just the idea of it all. And I had come from a long line of seamstresses. My mother loved to sew, more hobby for her.
Sure.
I mean, certainly clothes, even, in the 1960s and 70s, you were buying clothes. You were ready to make clothes. You weren't sitting at home sewing everything like you were in the 30s, 40s. Anyway, I just loved it, and so I thought, let's do something I love. I don't think my dad was all that happy about the idea because he thought, what are you going to do with this? But that's what I did.
Lo and behold. 2018, that's coming in handy.
Yeah, it is. You're right.
So were you politically active while you were at UGA?
I was. But only in the standpoint of I served as the Panhellenic Council member representative for my sorority on the larger UGA campus Panhellenic Council.
Okay.
I became interested in it as a junior because the preceding summer in Augusta, where I was working in retail home for the summer. I was taking 1 or 2 classes at Georgia, at Augusta College at the time, Augusta State University now. I had attended a party that was down the street. Sam Nunn was up for re-election. His chief of staff, whose first name was Bob, not Bob Hurt, someone else, I think, was a guest of honor. And the party was held at a high school friend's home. She'd invited people to come. We were now sophomores in college. I went to the party and was enthralled. That man, whatever his last name is, I know not, he sort of, I bit the bug.
Interesting.
It really was.
And this was a Democrat, Sam Nunn.
Very much so.
So what did you do after college? You graduated around 1980 or so.
June of 80.
So where did you head from there?
I first, right out of the bat, I went to Catherine Gibbs. Are you familiar with Catherine?
I am
no
not.
one is ever familiar. Well, in the 1940s.
Well, I'm from Illinois, so blame it on that.
There was a radio show host. Lord, I hope I'm not boring y'all.
No.
There was a radio show host in the 1960s by the name of Earl Nightingale. My mother was an avid listener. Earl Nightingale said, if you want your daughter to succeed in this world, she should go to Catherine Gibbs, which was an executive secretarial school.
Okay.
It was one of the top in the nation. It was primarily based out of New York and Boston. And they trained young women in protocol of business. How do you handle the most efficient and protocol and etiquette-wise letters of correspondence? How do you do all of the little innuendos in letter writing? How do you write? What would be a decent letter? You would be supportive of a male in business, and at that time it was always men.
I was just getting ready to ask.
Always
was
men.
an all female?
All female.
Okay.
I presume they would have accepted men, but no man was applying. By the time I got there in the fall of 1980, this postgraduate now, I was a Bachelor of Science degree major, finished. I had my diploma. Catherine Gibbs, recognizing that the world was changing and that young women do not want to do this, they offered an 8-week course for shorthand and typing.
Okay.
And this letter writing exercise and the protocol of how you do letters, how you dress, how you manage, a little bit of light bookkeeping, things like that. So my mother remembered this Earl Nightingale story, and she planted the seed and said, you're going to have more than just the ability to sew a dress. Why don't you do this program which will teach you how to type in a hurry, shorthand in a hurry? And I did. I went to Boston for 8 weeks and spent my savings account on this course. They put you in a dormitory. It was the most expensive typing class in probably the history of the United States. But I did it. I only came out typing about 35 words a minute, which is nothing. I mean, it was 8 weeks. You couldn't do it all. And shorthand, oh my Lord, that was a joke.
It's funny.
I mean, there are little codes I remember now, like in shorthand, the word business is a BZ. And the faster your hand could move across the page, eye-hand coordination, the better off you were. And I still was pretty slow at the end of 8 weeks. I needed 10, 12, 15 weeks.
So you spent 2 months in Boston.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that you were at the state capitol in 1981.
Okay.
So how do you...
How does this
connect the dots
jiggle
for me?
All right. It was the fall of 80. I
Okay.
graduated in June of 80 from here, UGA.
Mm-hmm.
September 1, I go to Boston for 8 weeks. That political seed had not left my head. The University of Georgia, in the spring of my senior year, fired my advisor from the College of Consumer and Family Sciences. And I was a little bit irritated by that. I thought she was the classiest thing going. She was not old-timey home economics. She was progressive in the way in which she wanted to market clothes, but it didn't work out. For some reason, I believe she was terminated. So I thought, well, I'm going to give it up too. I don't want to do fashion merchandising anymore. Typical college senior, they're out to conquer the world. They're ready to change things. I don't want to do this anymore. I flirted with maybe trying to go to business school, but anyway, I didn't. I went on to Catherine Gibbs.
Mm-hmm.
Came home at Thanksgiving. I asked my stepbrother, who had a friendship with the local state rep from Augusta, whose name was Sam Nicholson, I believe. I asked Representative Nicholson if I could please meet with him on a possible job at the state capitol. He said, sure. We met for lunch. I got all dressed up, and that's what you did in December of 1981. He sent me to the state capitol to meet with the secretarial pool at the state capitol, which is what they did back then. It's the way it was handled. I wasn't offended. No one was. That's just the way it was.
That's how it worked in the early 80s.
That's how it worked. And it was sort of a pool primarily of women because no men were applying. And you went in, you interviewed. I had the imprimatur of Catherine Gibbs on my resume, which was a fairly established and elite stamp.
Right.
As I left, the head honcho who was hiring people for the pool, and the pool would have gone around the state capitol and recorded minutes and taken notes in the meetings and that kind of thing. I was no more qualified or prepared. My shorthand wasn't fast, but she said, I think this will probably work out. Call me in a week or two. As I'm leaving her office, another woman seated at a desk whose first name was Janie. I know exactly who it is, but I can't think of her last name. I don't know that I ever knew it, but it'll come later in the story.
Sure.
Janie whispered to me, I think I know of something you would like better. So call me tomorrow. So I did. She said, the Senate minority leader needs an aide or has the funding to hire an aide for the session only. My niece is hiring the position. Call her. I did. I set up the appointment. Her name was Susan Knowles, Nalls, and she became a friend for life. We worked well together. Her specialty was the retirement pension system for the state of Georgia. And she was the top aide for the retirement committee, which was under the state Senator Franklin Sutton at the time. Senator Coverdell was on the committee. Senator Coverdell was the Senate minority leader, state Senate, of which there were 4 other members. I believe there were 5 Republican members in 1981, January of 81. Well, I never met him until I was on the job for 10 days. And I was the aide in that office, and it worked quite well. It was wonderful. It was everything I had wanted to learn and study about politics, and I refined the system of when you had constituents call in, whether it was the ALC, the ACLU, anybody, any union or any conservative group or whoever, or just a constituent. I was reforming the process for they've called about this bill. Here's why they want it. Here's why they don't want it. And then I would hand that folder to Senator Coverdell for the day's work.
Okay.
That's how that began.
So much more of a. Would you describe yourself as a chief of staff at that time, or that just be something like an office manager?
That wasn't even an office manager. That was a true aide.
Okay.
You sat there somewhat as a person who, at the last minute, go get this, go find this piece. We need to take this photograph across the hall to the House of Representatives and have them sign it. You need to answer these phones, return this call, see what this person wants. Go to the clerk's office and pull the bill on XYZ. I was more truly, in the truest sense, aide.
Okay. So describe for
a
me.
minor aid.
Well, describe for me the Paul Coverdell when you met him. What were your impressions of him?
A busy guy. Whew, on the move. I mean, that man hardly stood in one place for more than 3 seconds. He was constantly moving. I truly did not meet him. I had been on the job 10 days, reporting to Susan Knowles
Right.
and reporting to the secretary to the Senate Minority Leader's office, whose name was Suzanne Burns.
Okay.
And I was reporting to those two women. I met him, tall, thin, blonde, that's what I remember, a kind person. You know, he would really stop to make sure he'd heard what you said. He wasn't dismissive. And he seemed to really appreciate the system I had formed, these folders, and I had put the little note cards and taped them into the interior of the folder so they wouldn't spill out and stuff like that.
Well, how much did you know about Senator Coverdell's politics when you
That's a great question.
when you first got involved?
I didn't. I did not know what this man was going to champion or not champion. I had not studied it. Of course, back then, there was no internet. There was no, what you just read in the newspaper is what you saw or
Right.
what you knew. I didn't have time to do any research in the sense. When I first met with the secretarial pool over on the House side, that was mid-December. I had come home from Catherine Gibbs at Thanksgiving. I was traveling by my own car, my own gas, from Augusta to Atlanta to get the job. All of my UGA friends were living in Atlanta. That's why you wanted to come to Atlanta, because all your friends were here. And there were 3 apartment complexes, which were everybody was living in primarily, and so that's, you tried to get an apartment at one of those places. I didn't have a lot of time between when I met the House woman, December 15th, and then starting the General Assembly,
Okay.
which would have been January 3rd-ish or
Yeah.
so. Maybe between January 3rd and January 8th or 9th
Yeah.
is when the Georgia General Assembly would begin. And I was moving. I moved, my stuff up from Augusta. I didn't take the time.
Pretty busy time.
I didn't take the time to do much research.
So what did you learn once you were on the job about Paul Coverdell's politics, the Georgia Republican Party's politics at the time? How did that learning process take place, I guess, on the fly or on the job for you?
In reality, it probably didn't really happen until 6 or 9 months later, because the job was temporary.
Right.
The Senate Minority Aid was only for the legislature. Well, towards the end of the legislature, which would have been around March the 31st, his executive secretary up at the Coverdell and Company
Right.
was leaving to get married, and she was leaving the state. And because I had the Catherine Gibbs stamp of approval on that resume, she suggested that I apply or talk to, and so she had me come up to Coverdell and Company, and
Okay.
she interviewed me, and she offered me the job. He had obviously given his approval and said, "Sure, I think I can work with Molly," and so that's how we did it. And so April 1st, when the legislature ended, I then moved up to Coverdell and Company.
Now, was that in Buckhead?
It was. The building is still standing. It is taken over now by Piedmont Hospital's, the Harvey Mathis building. It's a 2-story red brick building right across the street from Shepherd Spinal Center.
Okay. I know exactly where it is.
Yeah, that was the building. And I trained. Oh my goodness, we met on Saturdays. I really trained. You had to do it her way, and I took on her systems, and she was a hard charging woman. She knew what she was doing. So it was more. I began to really get into it then.
Okay, so you've got you and Senator Coverdell both are working on the Coverdell and Company business, the insurance business.
Yes.
But at the same time,
Yes.
politics, the Georgia Republican Party is going on.
Absolutely.
Many times in the same building.
Oh, yes,
Okay.
most definitely. Most definitely. We had the top floor, pretty much the whole floor. Reagan had been elected in November of 80.
Mm-hmm.
Coverdell had been the George H.W. Bush finance chairman, and that threw him into the middle of it, which meant the White House was often calling Coverdell as Senate Minority Leader, State Senate, and as a former Bush-Reagan person.
I see.
And Fred Cooper had just been elected in May or June of 81. Coverdell was instrumental in getting him. That's what threw me into it.
Okay? Tell me about that experience, that state convention.
Okay, that state convention, I remember it pretty well. I didn't even volunteer. I went as a guest.
Okay.
Now, it was not a formal process as a guest. I went of my own volition because I was interested.
Okay.
It was the Cobb Civic Center. I went on Saturday and just sat there all day, fascinated, watching this process. The Coverdell people and Fred Cooper didn't even know I was there, but I was sitting up in the second floor in the arena, looking down on this floor. I was fascinated, absolutely fascinated.
Well, what drew, when most people think of a good time on a Saturday, they don't think sitting at the Republican state convention.
Exactly.
What drew you to that experience?
It was odd.
I think you and I would enjoy it, but I think we're the outliers, maybe.
I did. I had met Fred Cooper in April. He was a young, attractive, sort of mover and shaker. The White House had just turned over. National politics was becoming something. It's hard to describe. I wanted to watch it. I was a little lowly aide-de-camp, executive secretary, executive assistant in this company. And I was watching this fast-paced individual, Coverdell, run back and forth. I wasn't included in any of the meetings. I wasn't integral to the process.
Not at this point.
Not at this point, okay. Not at all. And then I just wanted to see it. I wanted Fred Cooper to win. It was almost like it was I would go to the Roman arena and watch the gladiators or something, It was.
Except the gladiators, it was Fred Cooper and Matt Patton.
Matt Patton, yeah. The enemy, friend versus enemy. And I wanted to see the friend win, You're right. It's very odd for a Saturday for me to go out there and sit and watch this thing for hours on end.
Well, since you mentioned it, something that Senator Coverdell was involved with for a long time was the Long Range Planning Committee.
Oh, yeah.
That Mac Mattingly and Bob Irvin got started, and others, John Linder, Newt Gingrich, back in the 70s. And I recall that Senator Coverdell really becomes a driving force in the 1980s.
Definitely.
When do you become involved in those meetings, those phone calls, things like that?
Along about 82,
okay.
I think.
So tell me about what would an average, quote, average meeting of a long-range planning committee, who was there, what were they trying to accomplish, why would they come to the Coverdell building to do all this? Give us the insider perspective.
I think he was with every group of people, organization, it's almost as if one person needs to take charge of the logistics. And he was a logistical master. He called the meeting, and to call the meeting really meant Molly needs to phone the assistants of X and Y and Z and poll the people to say, would 4 o'clock on Monday be better? 2 o'clock on Wednesday? Would Thursday night work? And then I would make charts, and 10 people maybe. There could be as many as 10 people who can do it at the most time. Then you call everybody back and say, okay, the meeting's now planned for 2 o'clock on Wednesday. And it was the people that you named. And then there were all of these outliers. John Lupton, who is no longer living now. I remember the name John Savage. And so you sort of have the local apparatus going on. You then have a White House apparatus going on where Coverdell might be called to the Republican National Committee because he was on the board of the National Republican Legislators Association, NRLA, which was a subset of the RNC purely for legislators. So you had that group of people going on. That was who ended up being governor of Michigan, John Engler. Mm-hmm. He was a state legislator at the time. Fred Finlinson from Utah. Victor Ashe from Tennessee. Was he a legislator or was he a mayor?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
Tennessee's out of my...
Meanwhile, you have these collections of people that needed to be managed and handled and phoned and returned calls and memos sent to them. You've got that going on. Then you also have Coverdell and Company business going on. And in 1982, I was becoming integral in the logistics of all of that. I really was a logistical. I felt like I became a logistical master in the long run.
Sounds like you
and
had to.
Often you were in the background phoning to get going what was needed, and I was not necessarily sitting in the middle of the meeting.
Okay. So one of the things that Senator Coverdell always talked about, and those who worked with him, were this network of point people in the different congressional districts.
Yes.
Maybe Randy Evans over in what I guess would have been the old 6th district, and others across the state.
Yes.
Sort of an eyes and ears of the Coverdell Network. What was Senator Coverdell hoping to accomplish with a network of folks across the state?
That's a great question because it leads from the conventions.
Okay.
When you were managing a state convention, you had floor people.
Right, your floor leaders.
Floor leaders. Many of those floor leaders, which would have been in the state convention of May of 81, and then would have been May of 83, those floor leaders became a part of this point system.
Okay.
And a great example is Eric Johnson, state senator from Savannah, who ended up running for governor back just in
2010.
Thank you. Eric Johnson was a great example. Joe Rogers of Waffle House was an example.
Did Ellett Poitevin?
Yes, I believe Ellett Poitevin was a point person. I'm sure some of the list of people, like from the 3rd and the 4th districts, it was one from every congressional district, or perhaps even go down a level, it might have been 1 or 2 people from the 1st congressional district, which would have been Chatham County plus maybe St. Simon's or Glenn. You might have had two people like that. And that's what I recall. The floor leaders operating at that convention would have been in the spring of 81. Those people ended up being a lot of the point people, the point committee, the point people. The 2nd district,
So the second district would
was
have been
was
down in
more
the south.
Bainbridge,
Yeah.
not Bainbridge necessarily, Albany. Albany.
Okay. Albany.
Oh, I can see his face. I can see the man's face. I can't think of his name right at the moment. It'll come to me tonight, I'm sure. People like that.
So what was that network brought? You said it's born out of these conventions. What's the utility of maintaining that network outside of a convention year or a convention event?
You wanted to make sure that if you were going to take control of the state and you were going to turn over seats at the state Senate level, turn over House seats at the state House level, you needed eyes and ears on the ground of who you might recruit to become a candidate or who you might recruit to be a finance chairman, because they were beginning to figure out this is going to be very expensive. If we're going to try to turn over the Republican and build our numbers, the point people were the people that could potentially do that. At least they could feed information. They could feed who were some wealthy business individuals in this community in town that we could listen to or ask for their opinion, and therefore they would give us money. Or who might be a candidate for ultimately agriculture secretary or secretary of state or some of the bigger posts. Or who might, President Reagan is going to come to Macon, all right? Who's going to make sure that all the people that Reagan wants to meet in the back room are going to be the right people? You don't want, someone who is not quite credible or on the up and up to be sitting there with President Reagan in the back room.
Well, that's a good segue to the next question. Was how much of this network or operation was in the Georgia Republican Party? You've always had factions, and there's the faction that came out of 1981 with the Mattingly, Cooper, Coverdell, Bob Bell sort of faction. You could lump some more in there, and then you had an older, more ideological, we'll say, faction.
Yeah.
Carl Gillis, Ted and Mary Stivers, Carolyn Meadows out of Cobb County, and there are more and more and more folks that I'm not thinking of.
Right.
But how much of it was to maintain influence and control over the party organization itself?
Well, it was probably a pretty good effort to do that, because, of course, Coverdell in the 1970s was considered very liberal.
Sure.
And the Ted Stivers faction, they didn't like that. They didn't want that. And I think Coverdell began to think there's got to be a happy medium.
Okay.
But he also began to think, I'm the new wave. I'm the one that can supersede and help grow this party, because if we are the old of the 1960s, we're not going to be able to grow this party. And that was the whole premise behind everything, is growing, building your numbers, building the bench strength. And as we are growing, and his influence is growing over the state because of the point system. And it wasn't a egotistical kind of process. It was more legitimately, it was like a military tactical officer, I guess.
In that we've tried it the other way. Now let's try it.
Oh, you're bringing it back. Okay, you're bringing it back. I got a little off.
No. Well, what I remember seeing, I think Senator Coverdell did an interview with, maybe it was Cliff Kuhn from Georgia State, or maybe even Mel Steele over at West Georgia. And he said something that within 48 hours, you could get all these people either in the room together or on some sort of a conference call. What sort of event would trigger something like that, where Molly has to get on the phone with all of these people and get them together. Do you remember what
That's
sort
a
of
great,
it?
great. Let me think, because Lord knows that was a lot of that. You're right. You're right on. That is the truth. Well, perhaps there would have been a movement towards. I cannot remember who was who was his opponent in 1985. Who for the Republican Party chairmanship? Who was Paul's opponent?
I don't know if he had one because Bob Bell was chairman. I don't think there was any significant opposition, unlike 81, and there really wasn't much of a challenge until 87 when Guy Davis jumped in against John Stuckey.
Okay.
But
Okay.
I could be wrong, but I don't think there was a whole lot.
Well,
of
my first thought was that what
maybe
would have,
there wasn't because of this.
Good point, and maybe that would have been a good example of why you would have called the point people together, and we called it the point people. You needed, maybe you had a person whose name had surfaced as perhaps an opponent for X, Y, and Z,
Right.
or if it wasn't an opponent against a Coverdell, it wasn't always an egotistical thing. It was more of maybe there was an opponent to President Reagan.
Sure.
That's a ridiculous example, but or maybe I'm trying to think, was there a public policy issue that might have caused the group to gather? I don't think it was public policy. I think it was pure
Party
politics. And let's keep the party moving in this direction.
I see.
Because if we take a step back, we're not going to succeed. We're not going to push forward.
Well, you mentioned that Senator Coverdell does become the state party chairman, which it sounds like he was already very much an influential driving force in the party. So what convinced him, do you recall, to take that formal step of becoming the state party chairman, which in the 1980s was not a glamorous position?
I was just getting ready to say, what I really recall is that I recall that he really wasn't real sure he wanted to do it.
Drew the short straw, as it were.
Drew the short, duty, honor. You had to do your part, and he had been driving this system to create openings in the state party for people that would be a good recruit. Well, okay, the next step is to be a legitimate chairman of the party. And I think his run, was sort of legitimatized.
Okay.
He's the only man that can do it. He's sort of the titular head already.
Right.
There would be people who would be offended by that.
Very much.
So forgive me, maybe I shouldn't say it on tape, but I think it was sort of duty. It's my turn. I have to do my part. I can't just stand here and lead people from the side. I got to get out there and do it. I can't be an assistant coach. I need to be the coach.
So did Coverdell and Company, the building, become sort of the de facto headquarters of the Georgia Republican Party between, in the mid-'80s when he was chairman?
The party was physically located down the street. Jay Morgan was the executive director. And he physically, I think probably Paul did say, Jay, you gotta rent space that's closer to this building because I can't go halfway across Atlanta to get to the party headquarters. And it was a group of young people.
I was getting ready to say, what do you remember working with Jay Morgan and those folks?
They were great. And Jay, we had a little Christmas party, and Jay, as the executive director, liked to give little gifts. He had a pretty good sense of humor.
He still does.
You know what my gift was?
What's that?
My gift was the paperback book, Dale Carnegie's How to Stop Worrying About Everything. Meaning,
was that a subtle message?
It was a big message. It was big. It meant Molly is constantly nagging me about, well, when is that meeting going to take place? Well, What's the address there? What are the directions? You know, this is pre-GPS. If you were the logistics coordinator for your chairman, you had to have directions and you had to have phone numbers and.
This sounds very stressed. I'm stressed out listening
dear.
to this.
Dear.
No. It just seems like it's hard, I think, for people of my generation to hear all the sort of energy and brain power it took to just do local arrangements for a meeting.
You have no idea. It is. I don't know that. I don't know how I did it either. I do remember little things like. I'm going to go ahead and say it. Forgive me because I'm a woman. I can say it. I could not stand when I had to ask directions and how to type out the directions for Senator Coverdell to get to some meeting somewhere across town. Maybe it was with John Linder or whoever. I hated to get a woman on the phone because she never could give me decent directions. I loved getting a man on the phone because men are navigationally unchallenged. Women are navigationally challenged. I remember that from the day I'll die. I'll remember that line in my head. Try to always get a man on the phone. Jay was fun. We had a good working relationship. I bugged him to death because Coverdell was big on closing the circle was his statement. If he asked a staffer, please give me a report on XYZ, or why is John Savage thinking about running for the House? One of the aides was Dan Serby. Dan, go find John Savage and ask him why he's going to do the House or why not the House or why is... Anyway, but if Dan Serby didn't close that loop, close that circle and come back to Paul with an answer, he would, call Molly, call Dan and see where that is. Where's the report? He was constantly... that man could follow through on most anything at any time. He could remember what he had asked people to do. And sometimes he'd send me a piece of paper with just a half a moon drawn on it. That was, close the circle with me, come back to me and tell me what you did about this. That was the way he operated.
Yeah, when I interviewed Jarvin Levison.
Oh, yes.
Jarvin said that he never saw anybody cram as much into a 24-hour day.
Yeah.
And he wasn't sure that the senator ever slept.
That was always...
Was that your impression as well?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I think so. And I worked hard too. I can only imagine. I mean, when I went to bed at night, my head hit that pillow. I was out. I remember leaving one day and turning to Senator Coverdell and saying, "Boy, I earned my pay today." I'd often leave exhausted.
Well, I mean,
we had a 3-day weekend, Memorial Day, and all of us, everybody, many of these point meetings were held on the weekends, and you just worked. It was a 6-day operation, and I remember we had a 3-day weekend once over Memorial Day, and I think I took it. And I remember saying, back at the office on Tuesday, I remember saying, "Boy, I sure needed that."
Well, I think John Linder said that when some folks would take a weekend off and go golf, Paul worked on politics. That was his weekend break.
That was his
quote
hobby.
Break. That was his.
It was the hobby. Yeah, it definitely was.
So,
yeah.
No, I was going to say 80.
Some would say he worked too hard, and did that a tribute to his early death.
Who knows?
You'll never know.
Sure.
Yeah, but there are people who would say that.
Well, we'll talk about that a little later. But one of the most stressful times for the party was 1988. With you've already mentioned that Senator Coverdell was very close with George H.W. Bush, who was vice president, as was Fred Cooper.
Yes.
Coverdell was the Southern coordinator, I think,
Yes,
for
yes,
in
that's
'88,
right.
and Fred was the Georgia campaign chairman. But that was also the year of Pat Robertson
Right,
and the Christian
right,
right.
right.
What do you remember about it? What do you remember about that experience at the Albany convention? Were you at the Albany convention, down the state convention down?
I was thinking Macon.
No, it was definitely
Which
Albany.
one was Macon? Yes, yes.
It was definitely Albany.
But it's funny that, why do I not remember that as well? What I do remember
Maybe you blocked it
better,
out.
what I do remember was the National Convention in New Orleans.
In New Orleans? Okay.
That I remember more than Albany. Was Albany John Stuckey and the state troopers had to...
And the broken gavel, and yep.
Okay, I do recall. It's moving so fast that I almost could not keep up with what was really happening.
I was going to ask you, what are your memories and impression of that? Okay.
I can't remember whether I was a delegate or not. A number of the state conventions,
You would have been a
was
Bush delegate.
Yes. Not nationally, just the state.
Right, a state delegate.
I may have been an alternate, and I may not have even have made it to the state convention as a official delegate or alternate. It might have been only at my convention, my district convention, the 5th Congressional District convention. But I would go as an aide. I was the aide de camp to the point system, to the point people committee. And sure, you needed little offshoot, Paul might need to go meet with Eric Johnson to go ask about such and such a delegate. Are they going to vote with us, or are they going to vote against us? Are they going to vote for our slate, or are they not?
Would have been busy.
And I would have been running around trying to find Eric Johnson. For the National Convention in New Orleans, that I recall vividly as being very stressful and very scary.
Tell me about that.
I remember being at a function with Paul and Nancy and Fred Cooper. I'm sure there were others, but those were the 3 that I remember. And I remember their being saddened that the Pat Robertson, it was as if Bush had sold out. And I think the gathering where I was, it was a social something, because all of these national conventions, typically the host town, I think we were in a private home, and whose ever home this was had hosted a function for the Georgia delegation and the Georgia alternates and all the staff that had gone too. I don't remember who the executive director of the state party was in '88, because Coverdell had moved on.
It might have been Bill Thorne, maybe.
Oh, now that's ringing a bell.
Maybe.
That is ringing a bell. I think you're right.
I think it was Bill Thorne.
I'm pretty sure you're right. Okay. I remember being stressful. I remember being saddened. But yet there was duty. You still were dutiful to George H.W. Bush. And you wanted him to win the nomination. You wanted him to win the presidency. You did not waver from that loyalty. Therefore, when you felt you were sold out, you just had to kind of, you sort of knew that George H.W. Bush had made his decisions for reasons, and you couldn't question those, and you held your head high, and you said, I'm still going to be for that man. I remember Lanny Griffith, who was the Bush, was he a White House staffer, or was he the George W. campaign staffer? But he was the coordinator for the Southern Committee.
I think he would have been I should have looked at my notes, but he would have been in the campaign organization. He was either the White House political person,
exactly,
because there was also,
he might have been
what was
both.
his name, Bond, Rich Bond.
Yes.
So,
Gosh, I hadn't thought about that name in ages. I will tell a very funny sort of side story. Is that fair to do?
No, absolutely.
Okay, this was really funny.
We have to keep these things light sometimes.
This was really funny. Okay. I think it was after this very tense, this unfortunate sort of saddened gathering at this private home. Paul and Nancy say that we're going to dinner. Molly, come on and go to dinner with us. I think that Coverdell knew he needed to be accessible to people, staffers, in the event that something was going to break that night.
Okay.
In the event. So we went on to dinner, and I don't know where we were at dinner. We were at one of the New Orleans restaurants. And if I'm recalling, it was just 3 of us. And Paul said to me, I think you need to go get Lanny Griffith on the phone. Let me see if I can talk to him. I've just thought of something that might help. I don't know what it was. So I thought, this was before cell phones. How am I going to find a phone? I went running around the restaurant. I found the phone in the ladies' room. It was a wall hanging on the wall. It was a wall phone, pay phone on the wall. But it was near the entrance to the ladies' room. So I got Lanny Griffith on the phone, and I said, Lanny, hold on a second. Let me go get him. And I dropped the phone. Why a woman in the restaurant did not hang it up, to this day, I know not, because I'm not sure I could ever have gotten Lanny Griffith back on the phone. I mean, this man was in demand. I hurry to the table where Paul and Nancy are, and I said, I've got him. I've got him on the phone. Come quick, because I don't want to lose him. Somebody might hang the phone up. So Paul jumps up. He follows me through the waiters of holding trays and the people at the den, loud, and it was very loud. And we get to the ladies' room, and I said, I've got him on the phone. The phone is in the ladies' room. And Coverdell stopped dead in his tracks. The ladies' room? How am I going to do that? And I said, it's okay. It's just right inside the door. Just we'll do it. I'll keep all the women at bay.
And you can't stretch a payphone cord.
And it was right there, it's right there in the corner, and the door was right there. And Paul walks in and shields his eyes and stands in the corner with the phone. Lanny, I'm in the ladies' room, so I don't know how long I'm able to talk. And then he said, but you need to call so-and-so because so-and-so has just said something I couldn't even hear. But I had done my job. I had gotten Lanny Griffith on the phone, and it was done, That was my role.
Well, and ultimately successful, George H.W., excuse me. We'll talk about him later. But George H.W. Bush is successful. So the Peace Corps comes pretty quickly after that.
Yeah.
Tell me how Senator Coverdell went from state Senate minority leader to director of the Peace Corps. How do you remember that?
Okay.
Elapsing.
I do not know whether Paul said something to a Lanny Griffith or to Ron Kaufman,
mm-hmm.
or the reverse. One of those individuals said something to Paul about, do you want a position in the administration? Because when you work as hard as Coverdell did, or as Fred Cooper did, and others, you are rumored, you are thought about, you are suggested, you're a loyalist, you are offered a work within the administration of some form or fashion. Mm-hmm. I don't know which came first.
Right.
But something happened, and all of a sudden, I remember Paul saying, not to me, but to someone maybe it was in a meeting or a group setting, it appears that George W. Bush has thought about me as my demeanor and my personality would be great for the Peace Corps. And that's the first time I remember hearing, oh, it might be the Peace Corps.
And did you end up going to Washington?
Yeah. So I and 2 other staffers.
So how did that work? He still got the business back in Atlanta. How does that logistically work out?
That's a good question. Smart. Michael Levison, Jarvin Levison's son, was the chief of staff or chief operating officer of Coverdell and Company. Perhaps his title was already president. And he was doing a jam-up job. He was really quite good. And of course now at this point, Coverdell's life is almost 50 to 65, maybe even 70% politics and ensuring that George H.W. is elected and managing this Southern Strategy Committee that Michael Levison was doing a lot of the Coverdell work. And that was the transition was already essentially done. And I was working well with Michael. Pam Procknow, who ultimately married Powell Moore, was upstairs, and she was managing a lot of there was some of the fundraising. She was managing the money. She was sort of doing the funding of so much. She was also doing some constituents work because he was still in the state senate and you needed, so-and-so was still wanting the traffic light and Pam was trying to handle some of that. And I was a logistical manager, administrative assistant, truly in the truest sense, downstairs, because we had moved to a building on Piedmont Road by this point. And that's why I say when Pam was upstairs. So Pam and Lee Radonis and myself go to work for the Peace Corps, which was, you just don't go to work. You have a federal application you must fill out. You have to pass muster. You have to ensure
the civil service.
You have to ensure that you are, if you're a political appointment, that it is a position within the political structure of the federal government, the executive branch, that will accept you. Are your credentials enough of a Republican to be in a political spot? And the three of us, Pam, Lee, and I, all met that criteria.
Sure. So how did your job change from Coverdell Company, Georgia Republican Party, at the Peace Corps? What was your job? What was a typical day for you like?
It was administrative and logistics. The position at the Peace Corps was, let me think, Director of Administration, Director's Office.
Okay.
I did not have my responsibilities at the Peace Corps were keeping the director his train running, setting up the meetings, making his calendar, making the point, by the way, the point system had now shifted, and he gave that up. And he asked Joe Rogers of Waffle House to take it on. And his assistant, Sherry Fallon, who was the secretary down at the state capitol for Senate Minority Leader's post, she took on the point system because Joe Rogers agreed to hire her to come to work for Waffle House.
Okay.
And she then could manage politics, whereas when you're down at the state capitol as a secretarial person, you can't do politics. And this way, then Joe Rogers hired her as a Waffle House employee, and he expected her to do everything that any other Waffle House employee would do, such as you have to take shifts like on Christmas Day, I think it is, as a Waffle House employee. Yeah, it's a tough
dedication.
It's a dedicated work at Waffle House. Anyway, Sherry Fallon went to work for him, and he took over the point system.
Okay.
Because supposedly Sherry Fallon understood it well enough to keep it going.
So, even though Joe Rogers and Sherry Fallon are, overseeing the point system and the sort of the old network, did you and Senator Coverdell remain sort of plugged into politics back home, or was it just too much going on in Washington?
It was too much. It was too much. And in reality, I think the point system began to fall apart. I don't think it worked quite as well. So then you begin to think, well, maybe it was the personality of the Coverdell aura, the Coverdell umbrella that kept that system going through the 1980s. But I think by about 1990, it had sort of fallen by the wayside. I did not participate in any conventions at that point. It was too much. You couldn't be in Georgia.
Right.
I was living in Washington and
flying around the world, I would assume.
No.
You stayed in the office?
I did not have any international responsibilities.
Well, that's kind of disappointing. You didn't even get a flight.
You want to know the truth? I personally was relieved.
Okay.
Only because it gave me a break. If Coverdell was overseas, it gave me a break. That was
your vacation.
It really was. I was able to have a peaceful day. It wasn't this constant harangue of, get this, move this, let's find this person, call this, I need to be here, call so-and-so. And it did. I once told him, I said, if you didn't go overseas, I'm not sure I could do my job. You had domestic responsibilities. You had to keep things going. And here's a great example. I remember he was invited to a White House state dinner. The Czechoslovakian prime minister, or whatever the title was coming, or Hungarian. The Hungarian was the Peace Corps was the first agency, U.S. agency, over the Berlin Wall, the Iron Curtain, because we sent volunteers to teach English in Hungary and Czechoslovakia, and it was the first U.S. agency, and that was a to-do, man, that was a big to-do, and it was a big effort because the returned Peace Corps volunteers didn't like it. It wasn't, that was too, it's an aura of the Peace Corps. If you're not digging ditches or taking care of babies, you don't need to be in a second world or first world country.
I see.
You need to dig the ditches in the third world, and that's the mission of the Peace Corps. Don't do anything but that. Going into Czechoslovakia and Hungary, even right after the Berlin Wall falls, they're communist countries, but they are more second and first world.
Sure.
It's
more
Central
developed.
Europe. Central Europe, and that was a huge rub within the policy of the Peace Corps. Yeah. Well, I got off subject anyway. White House is having a big state dinner for Hungary. Some official. They invited the Peace Corps director to go. Well, that entails, though that's very minor. I don't even know why I thought of that. That's kind of minor of how to organize some of the logistics. What you have to properly RSVP. What gate do you use? What gate do you, on Coverdell's agenda, he had an agenda. Every day of his life there was a typed agenda of what the next day was, from 2:30 to 2:32, you're speaking to Joe Rogers on the phone, little stuff like that. This went on, we started that in 1981.
A regimented
day's agenda, and it was typed up on an index card in the early years, and then in the later years, it was pages of staple. You might have 17 meetings when he was in the U.S. Senate in a day of Georgia activities,
sure.
And we tried to, when you could put the font down and put it on a little staple on a little card that could be then inserted in his breast pocket.
Okay.
I divert, sorry.
No. Well, you mentioned the Senate. Were you around for those conversations of him making the decision to go from Peace Corps director to Senate campaign mode?
Oh, yeah.
Tell me about that.
There were a lot of us. And I'm thinking of when he first mentioned his desire to run for the U.S. Senate against White Fowler. I remember his telling me that he was thinking about doing this, and I'm sort of, I don't remember a real reaction. It just was if this is just another...
The next thing.
It's just the next thing. I don't remember thinking anything of it. I do remember his saying, White Fowler is simply too liberal for our state, and he is not representing our state well for national policy. And I think our state is now ready to turn, and I think I could do this. Well, so were a lot of other people too. Mattingly, Johnny Isaacson had all, in public, flirted with running for the Senate.
Right. Mattingly, who had been senator until '86 when Fowler defeated him.
Exactly.
And Johnny had just run for governor.
Exactly. And
in
defeated. '90. Exactly. In fact, that was the absentee ballot that I FedExed.
Okay.
It was the vote for Johnny Isaacson for governor. And I was sitting at my Peace Corps desk filling out the form for FedEx and walking down the street in Washington to the FedEx office to go pay the bill to have it FedExed to Fulton County. That was an expensive absentee ballot.
I'm sure. So what role did you play in the campaign? Just sort of that sort of personal aide, chief of staff position that you had been, working at since '81.
But
82?
I had a niche.
Okay.
That nobody else in the campaign had, that was to my advantage. The Peace Corps, part of the Peace Corps mission had been to raise money for the Peace Corps Foundation and involve the nation. Coverdell got a list of names from the George H.W. presidency, like Howard Leach, I think was a name, in San Francisco, and so-and-so in San Diego, and so-and-so in Chicago. And you would go around the country as a Peace Corps director, calling, could I meet with a group of people in your inner circle that might be willing to give money to the Peace Corps Foundation? And the Peace Corps Foundation did numerous things typical to the mission of the Peace Corps. Pam Prochnow was the staffer at the Peace Corps in charge of that money, in charge of all that activity. I just helped coordinate.
Right.
She was actually getting the money in the door. Okay, but that network around the United States, as a candidate for the U.S. Senate, they were typically conservatives coming out of the George H.W. Bush regime, his point system around the United States. Well, so Coverdell could call so-and-so in Dallas, can I please meet with your inner circle? I'm running for the U.S. Senate in Georgia. I'm clearly raising money. Would you be willing to hold a party, hold a gathering? Could we just raise money in your Mr. Howard Leach in San Francisco? Molly had that Rolodex. I had those people that he had been communicating with around the country for Peace Corps. I now had it that I could go into the campaign, and I was in charge of out-of-state fundraising. I was also still in charge of the schedule, the agenda. I never was really very far from the next day's activity. The master of the calendar. I was sort of the master of the calendar. And it was a big
staff
calendar.
Secretary, scheduler.
Absolutely.
No meeting goes unless it goes through you.
Absolutely. Kind of thing. Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. So that network gave me the ability to call Mr. Howard Leach. Okay, candidate Coverdell can come into San Francisco. Would you be willing to pull something like this together? You know, and that took a lot of coordinating and activities. And, well, how much money are you thinking about? Well, how about millions? Well, that's a joke. No one, you can't do that. Can't do that legally. But but your point is you're trying to raise as much as you possibly can. And, you know, some of that is a little bit of a give and take and negotiation. You can't fly out to San Francisco and raise $200.
Yeah.
You know, so I think I was able to finesse some of that. I was able to pull it off and get it going and manage it and help get the money in the door. I knew the people.
Right.
I didn't know them. I knew them by phone call.
Right. But you know, a lot of networking. You never meet many people face to face.
You don't. You're right. You're meeting them over the telephone. Right. Now you're meeting them over emails and
that's right.
text and Skype. But back then it was just over the phone.
Well, who were the other people on the campaign? Sort of those key staffers on the campaign that
Eric
you remember.
Tannenblatt. And Eric, we met Eric through Lanny Griffith. Eric had been an intern or an aide in the White House. It was Lanny Griffith's office in the White House, political director of the White House. And Eric had served. And Eric had been at Emory University, so he knew Atlanta, wanted to be an Atlantean, wanted to be a Georgian. And Lanny called Coverdell and said, would you hire, this is a young man who's got a lot of promise, a lot of insight, good political sense, would you? So Eric came to work for the Peace Corps for a little while. Intergovernmental affairs, I think it was. You know, sort of a liaison for the Peace Corps to the State Department, to the Ag Department, to the White House, liaisoning.
Okay.
Anyway, so Eric came to the campaign.
Okay. Anybody else that you remember playing?
Pam Procknell stayed in Washington. She wanted to stay in Washington. She stayed. Lee Rodanis came home, but he was beginning to not be that interested in campaign.
Sure.
He wanted to do more editorial writing, which I think he did.
So when did Tom Perdue come on? That was something of a coup when
was a big coup. Yeah. Fred Cooper was the one who, if I recall, got that done. Fred Cooper was the one who said he's got the muscle, he's got the imprimatur, he is a strong man. He will tighten things up. He knows how to do it. He knows how to do statewide. He's got his own good network. He can do this. You should talk to him. So he did, and there he was the campaign manager.
Okay, so Tom Perdue had been with George Busby. He'd been with Joe Frank Harris. Was he welcomed with open arms in a Republican campaign by Georgia Republicans that you recall?
You know, that's a good question. Yeah, I think I'd have to say he was. There was a little bit of an untrustworthy in the idea of, oh, do we really want to do this? But he knew what he was doing.
Sure.
He knew how to do it. And see, there hadn't been much of a Republican statewide staffer or executive director or
sort of that political consultant.
Exactly, for the Republicans. There had never been that before. You didn't have that bench strength. And he was needed. Yeah. So, and I think people began to recognize.
Sure. Well, I'm sitting here looking. I think you had a primary runoff, general election runoff.
Unbelievable.
Do you remember anything from that campaign, or is it a blur?
Oh, no, I remember lots. I remember lots and lots and lots. I remember that in the general runoff, when that came, out-of-state fundraising was no longer even on the front burner. The money was pouring in the door. You could not even count it. It was happening so fast. The fundraiser, her name was Laura Butler. She made the comment, "This is unbelievable. I cannot even get all of the mail answered, opened, processed. You had to enter the checks into the system. You had to know where, you had to FEC, you had to know where they were coming from." She said,
before the day of online contribution.
Oh, yeah.
So this was just
pure
P.O. box, just buckets.
just pouring. People walking in, giving checks. People around the state were raising the money, give me, bringing it to the headquarters, mailing to that. Anyway, out-of-state fundraising was no more. I did nothing but scheduling. It was 15, 18 hours a day of pure, unadulterated, just scheduling event after event after event. So that I remember.
How many events would the senator do a day during that runoff?
The general runoff, it could have been, oh gosh, Ashton, this is a hard one, 8-ish.
Wow.
Wow. I remember in the U.S. Senate, I remember counting a typical average day, because I had to do this a number of times, was about 17 meetings.
The TikTok.
So I'm going to count that, and we'll cut that in half and say maybe about 8. We could have 2 events at night where you'd go to a person's home and have a reception at a home, fundraiser at home. You'd go to another home, all well coordinated. The logistics had to be within reason. You had fly-arounds where you'd get in a plane and you'd go around the state. You could hit 8 cities in a day if you were fast. You could hit, probably reality was more like 5. You'd have press conferences in all of those cities, and you might have a little fundraiser at the airport hangar, coffee in the back room, or you could leave the hangar and go to someone's home and have. I would say anywhere from 5 to 8. Now, initially, when you first started out and you were running for the Senate, you were doing good to have 1 a day. I don't think we had 1 a day even initially in the very beginning days. In the beginning, Coverdell was more on the phone, calling people, calling that old point system.
Call time.
Call Willow Lassiter in Moultrie and see if he can't organize a fundraiser. I'm running for the Senate for these reasons, Call time. Exactly.
So why do you think there was such that response of donations for the runoff, and why do you think you were ultimately successful in winning that runoff election in '92?
Several reasons. I think our state was turning to a very conservative movement. I think that, I don't know the numbers on state Senate House or state Senate seats, but I think it was already beginning to turn a bit. Reagan Bush had had a very successful 12 years. You were on the coattail of that. I think Paul Coverdell could work like nobody else. He was a hard worker. He was passionate about, and people believed him. He was an honest and forthright individual. I think White Fowler came across as the opposite. I think he began to be a little bit arrogant with flippant. Perhaps flippant is a better way of putting it. White Fowler had also been one of the 5 in the House who had bounced checks. The House had floated checks. I don't know whether it was, I can't remember whether it was only 5 people had bounced the checks, but do you remember that banking scandal?
The house banking scandal, I think David
Or-
Worley and I talked about.
Or whether 5 were the top 5, and there had been many people, 25, 50, 75 members of the House
I
had
think Newt Gingrich was even
floated the checks. But there were
Yeah.
the top of the list, and I think the top 5, Fowler was in one of those. And I think that irritated people, and I think they thought, he's got to move on. So, did Coverdell win, or did Fowler lose?
It's usually a bit of both.
And that's what
in
I'm
any
saying.
campaign.
That's what I'm saying.
Well, you've already mentioned, you went back to Washington as staffer, chief of staff in Washington. 16, 17, 18 events a day, things like that.
Yeah.
What were the issues that Senator Coverdell gravitated towards once he was in the U.S. Senate?
Lord, I did so enjoy that job. And I did because you were working for Georgia. And Paul made it so clear to all of us, we are here for Georgia. We are here for Georgians. We will not be arrogant about our work. We're not going to be lofty and higher than thou. We are going to work it at the grassroots level. And everybody who walked in that office got thank you notes, and it drove the staff crazy. It even drove me crazy sometimes too, but he was so insistent on
Now,
it.
did he learn that from George Bush, or did George Bush learn that from Paul Coverdell? Because that's one of the things that anybody who ever had anything to do with George Bush was they would always get a thank you card.
I think
Or maybe they were just of the same mold.
I think it was equal. I think they were the same mold. Some of that was growing up in the eras in which they did, and that's what you did.
Right.
You did not write a thank you note. I know that our society today has way gotten away from that. But anyway, oh dear, let me think. What your question?
What we were talking about, what issues? Did
yes,
Senator Coverdell really gravitate towards?
Agriculture. He felt like Georgia was a true agricultural state. He had grown up on farms. He considered himself a farming family from Iowa. And he understood, he knew what that was all about. He understood the need of farming, and he wanted to be a decent and good agricultural committee member. Now, there was a dichotomy because he came across as the lawyer in the black suit,
the Buckhead Republican.
the Buckhead Republican, the limousine liberal, that's the way he came across. Big insurance man, and insurance. Sometimes the word insurance can have a little bit of a. It wasn't your what would be a good word? It wasn't your intellectual, legal.
I see.
High standard background. Anyway, he wanted to be farming and farmers, and ag policy came first and foremost. He also was interested in, I think from a personal standpoint, he was interested in our foreign relations of this nation. Now, was that going to help Georgia? It's just like people said, I think Fred Cooper was one of the first to say it, Paul, is being Peace Corps director going to help you in the Senate, going to help you get to the Senate in the state of Georgia?
I can hear him saying that.
I don't know that, I think that was a very legitimate point, very legitimate strategy.
Sure,
is this going to help you?
Well, I mean, there was a lot when Senator Walter George, there was a lot of consternation when he went from I believe, either appropriations or armed services to Senate Foreign Relations chair. And it's a very prestigious position.
Exactly.
But if you're talking about that constituent relations, patronage, federal dollars position.
Exactly. Oh,
maybe not so much.
Oh, yeah, definitely. He was very initially, one of the first things that came out was the motor voter law. Within the first 6 months, perhaps, of his taking on the position, becoming our sworn elected U.S. Senator. He was opposed to the motor voter legislation. He felt that it was going to diminish the role of voting. Voting is a serious matter. It should not be just someone who is signing up for a driver's license to, oh yes, okay, as a little sidebar, I'll check the box to become a registered voter. He felt like that there needed to be more of a higher thought process, give it more of a stature. And I remember he went to Jim Jeffords of Vermont.
Yep.
And he said, let me understand why you want to do this. I would like for you to consider my view of why we should not do it. Jim Jeffords said, I hear you. We disagree. Paul was like, oh, okay,
Well,
this is how it's going to be in the U.S. Senate.
There you go. Well, I read something, and this may have been after the senator passed away. Trent Lott, he was quoted as saying, whenever he had a problem or a sticky issue,
Oh, yeah.
let Mikey do it.
Yeah.
What was that all about?
Okay, and I remember. You would have been familiar by reading that the Life cereal, I don't know who, the brand Life, but I don't remember who made, General Mills.
Probably. You should know this.
I should, you're right, I don't. The ad in the 1970s and 80s was of the little fella Mikey, and the older brother, what's this, pushing it, Mikey would eat it. Oh, this is good. Paul took on in 1994 the chairman of the Republican Senate House leadership dinner. I can't recall the exact name of it, but it was the leading fundraising opportunity between the two bodies in Washington every year, and it was the big kahunas, the big companies, the big corporations, political action committees would bring in the big CEOs and the big, like Rex Tillerson perhaps of Exxon would be there sitting at a table, and it would be this massive production of fundraising, eating, probably a little bit of drinking.
Sure.
At the Washington Civic Center, I think. They were all very elegant affairs, and usually the decorations were beautiful and things like that. And they had big speakers, and if it was a president, if it was during the presidential years, they might have even had a Republican president. I presume George Bush had been a speaker in the past. Well, in 92, 93, 94, you didn't have the Republican president, so they needed somebody to organize the dinner. So Coverdell was the dinner chairman, and it was an enormous amount of work, and most people hated it because it was a lot of phoning.
A lot of logistical.
A lot of logistics. I didn't have to do any of that. There was a paid staff to do it. The only thing I had to do was to make sure the trains were running if Coverdell was due in Betsy Economo's office to Belace call time for 2 hours, not 2 hours, they never did it for that length, but say an hour, to call the chairman of Exxon to please help out with this fundraising opportunity. I had to make sure Coverdell was there. Okay. And then the schedule had to say the time, when, where, who was in charge, what staff would go with you, who will you meet, who was those kinds of things. Right. The trains were needed to run on time. And I didn't have to do any of that. But that's why because the Republican conference that met every Tuesday at lunchtime of Republican senators, the Democrats had the same, no staff, just the Senate would have lunch together and talk through things. Trent Lott would say, well, let's let Mikey do it because Paul will take it on. And he did. He took it on. He did it for two terms, maybe 3. People loved him doing it because they said he did it beautifully. They
didn't have to do it.
And they didn't have to do it. They complimented him up and down that he really did it well and did it seriously, and people loved him. The staff loved him. Yeah.
You stayed up in Washington during the '98 reelect.
Yeah.
So that you were minding the store back in Washington.
Yeah. Yeah.
Where were you when you first heard that the senator had fallen ill?
I was here
in 2000.
I was here in Atlanta, and I knew that for the 2 weeks prior, he had been sort of complaining of a headache, and Shirley Pachalski had said, "You want to take my Imitrex?" And he said, "No, I'm not going to take that. I'm not going to take that. I don't take other medicine." But we were to meet that Saturday, and he called and said, "I can't come into the office. I was in Atlanta.
Okay.
I was at the Atlanta office, which was headquartered at Colony Square.
His Senate office here?
Right.
Okay.
Right. The district office.
The official, right.
The official office. And he said, "I can't come in. I'm nauseated." So I knew something was wrong. But anyway, he got to feeling better, and we met at the McDonald's on Peachtree Street over a Sprite, and we got all of our papers handled. There was lots going on that next week. Bill Roth was due in for a lunch on Monday. I don't remember why. It wouldn't be money raising. Why was it? Maybe it was that Bill Roth was running for re-election. This would have been 2000.
It would have been 2000. Roth was out of Delaware?
Yeah. He was in Delaware. And so he was flying in that morning. Anyway, there was a lot going on that next week. And so we were getting ready for the week. And, he looked a little peaked or a little pale. And but I really didn't think anything of it. And we finished our meeting, finished the papers and what had to be done and signed, and moved, to well, how do you want to handle this? How do you want to do this? How do you want to handle that? Those was our typical meetings. Right. He gets out of we leave the McDonald's, I get in my car, drive away. Bye, see you later, see you on Monday. And then his wife called me Saturday night, Nancy, to see what was the latest doctor he had seen. And that's how I knew. She said, I hate to tell you this, but I've called the paramedics and he's been admitted to Piedmont. And so she was then followed in her car, and she was at Piedmont. And that's how I knew.
And Chief of Staff, you obviously got updates and everything pretty regularly.
Oh, yeah. Oh, definitely. It was a very stressed, terrible time. Shirley and I talked that night. Eric and I talked. If I recall, I think Nancy wanted to talk to Jimmy Burns, who was Eric's father-in-law, who was an MD.
And that's Dot Burns'
husband, Jimmy. Right. He was an MD. And he had seen Paul, not recently, but and I think Nancy was interested in talking to him. I was trying to find Eric. It was a Saturday night. Mm-hmm. I was taking golf lessons, and I had gone to a golf lesson that late afternoon, and had come home. And Nancy left a message on the voicemail, so I called her right back. Yeah.
So when did you learn that he had passed away?
Many of us had gathered at the hospital Tuesday afternoon. His family, his nieces, nephews, his mother, his sister, her husband, Fred Cooper, I, the top staff, Alex Albert, Eric Tannenblatt, and his wife Mary, who was a MD. any other staff, I don't know. We were all at Piedmont Hospital, and we had pretty much been there for probably most of the day. And the doctor, one of the big, I think his name was Bill Stewart, one of the bigger docs at Piedmont, had come in and said, I need for everyone to know there's not much more we can do. And, you just burst into tears. Nancy was not with us in that room. She was in with Paul, who was in ICU.
Right.
And the men, Frank Strickland, some of his best friends, John Parker, and then you just don't even know what to do. You don't even know. Oh, it's just.
Well, I mean, that gets down to the practical side of it is, your job was running the office in Washington. And the senator's not there anymore. What did that, if you can talk about, what was that process?
Sure.
What did it mean?
Oh, sure.
Or what did it mean for you? What did you have to do?
I do remember on Monday, before he had passed away, the press was gathering outside of Colony Square. And I remember saying to everyone, we are at work. This is what Senator Coverdell would want us to do. We are going to be open. We're going to be, manning our post. And it was glum. It was just, everybody was, you couldn't do work. I mean,
Right.
You weren't, the phones were not ringing. People, you were, the staff who were the least close to him and who had been uninvolved with him probably were stepping up to the plate to quickly answer the phone. And, they would just say, please bear with us. We are dealing with a lot right now, and we have no further information. We are at work. We are trying. We're routine kind of thing. And the D.C. people were continuously being updated, and I can't remember by whom. If it was myself, if it was Shirley, if it was Eric, Alex Albert. I remember looking down at my desk and looking at something that he had written, see me, meaning it was like one of those closing the circle kind of things, but see me, S-E-E-M-E, meant bring this paper to me because I have something on this piece of paper that will remind me of something I need to ask you to do, to handle, to see to investigate.
Right.
And I remember looking down and saying to myself, oh, well, let me put it in my see me file. I'll need to ask him about this later. You just go through that machination in your head.
How involved, if at all, were you or the staff in that special election process with the party trying to select?
You mean after his death?
Yes. Yeah.
The special election.
Yeah, in July to November.
I was very involved. Very.
How so?
I went Mattingly. Mattingly was the final choice. The convention was in Philadelphia. Coverdell died on the 18th of July. The convention was within 3 weeks after that, mid-August, late August. We were all due to go, several of us.
Oh, sure.
I was going to go. I think Nancy was a delegate. I was not a delegate or an alternate, but I was going to go just for aid purposes. And, there were plenty of things I could do.
So.
The work, right. So naturally, we all canceled. I mean, there was just, anyway. I do remember sitting at my desk and learning that Lewis, he was the chairman of Trans, the Value Jet. Okay, Lewis. His first name was Lewis. Anyway, oh, I can see the guy. What was his last name? This is embarrassing.
Jordan. Is
Thank
it
you.
Jordan?
That's it.
Yep.
There you go. Very good. Lewis Jordan was potentially going to be the other candidate. And Mattingly. Mac Mattingly. Well, my loyalty within two sects was with Mattingly. You know, I mean, he had put his work, he had done his work in the trenches through the years. And I was with him. And, you know, I knew his wife, and I did not know her that well, not at that time. So I'm sorry that I don't recall the actual transition into his opening the campaign. But by law, the Senate office only had 60 days. You had to close your office up in 60 days, and everybody was off the payroll. Well, in all fairness, people began to look for other work. Very fair, very appropriately.
Rightfully so, sure.
Rightfully so. I did not want to be in the Senate. I felt like Miller didn't want me either. He offered a 2-week transition. He said, "Would you like to stay on for another 2 weeks?" And I said, "Thank you, but